March 3rd, 1943, 10:27 in the morning, Huon Gulf, New Guinea. Captain Paul Gunn pushed the control yoke forward and felt his modified B-25 Mitchell drop toward the ocean surface. Behind him, 11 more bombers followed in loose formation, their engines roaring as they descended through clear tropical air. At 200 feet above the waves, Gunn leveled off and checked his airspeed. 190 miles per hour, fast enough to close distance, slow enough to aim. Through the nose of his aircraft, past the 450 caliber machine guns he had personally installed where a bombardier's station used to be, Gunn could see them. 8 Japanese transport ships, 8 destroyers, 16 vessels steaming in tight formation toward Lae, their decks packed with soldiers and supplies. The largest enemy convoy to attempt a daylight run to New Guinea since the war began. Gunn had spent the last 9 months preparing for this moment, not in a factory or a planning room, but in a workshop at Eagle Farm Airfield in Brisbane, Australia, with wrecked fighter planes and borrowed tools. He had taken light bombers designed for medium-altitude attack and transformed them into something the Japanese had never encountered. Low-level strafers, commerce destroyers, aircraft that could tear a ship apart with gunfire before releasing bombs at masthead height. The Japanese convoy did not know what was coming. Their lookouts scanned the sky for high-altitude bombers, their anti-aircraft guns pointed upward, their fighter cover circled at 15,000 feet, waiting to intercept formations that would never arrive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Gunn and the 5th Air Force were about to demonstrate in the next 15 minutes would change naval warfare in the Pacific. Not through superior numbers or overwhelming force, but through tactical innovation born from desperation. The modified strafers represented a new doctrine: skip bombing at wavetop height, concentrated machine gun fire to suppress deck guns. Attacks so low and fast that enemy gunners could not depress their weapons in time. The convoy carried 6,900 Japanese soldiers, the 51st Division's main body, reinforcements desperately needed to hold Lae against Allied advance. If these troops reached shore, they would dig into prepared positions. The campaign to retake New Guinea would stall, months of fighting would stretch into years. But if the convoy could be stopped here, in open water, with aircraft alone, if ships could be sunk without a single Allied warship firing a shot, then Japan's ability to reinforce its garrisons would be shattered. The logistics network sustaining Japanese forces across the Southwest Pacific would collapse. The war would shift. Gunn understood this. So did every pilot following him down toward the water. They had practiced skip-bombing techniques for weeks. They had test-fired their modified weapons over empty ocean. They had studied reconnaissance photographs of Japanese convoy formations and planned their attack runs. Now they would discover if field modifications made in Australian workshops could sink warships built in Japanese naval yards. If improvisation could defeat doctrine, if America's industrial advantage, not just in producing aircraft, but in adapting them, could overcome Japan's head start in Pacific combat experience. The Japanese transports grew larger in Gunn's gun sight. He could see individual sailors on deck, could see the rising sun painted on smokestacks, could see the white water churned by propellers as the convoy tried to increase speed. Gunn's finger moved to the firing button. Behind him, his squadron was spreading into attack formation. The moment of convergence had arrived. To understand why March 3rd, 1943, mattered so profoundly, you must understand what Japan believed about naval power and what America had learned about survival. Since December 7th, 1941, since Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had conquered an empire. They had taken Wake Island in 16 days, Hong Kong in 18, Manila in 26. Singapore, Britain's fortress in Asia, had fallen in 70 days. The Dutch East Indies, with its oil fields and rubber plantations, had surrendered by March of 1942. Everywhere Japanese forces advanced, Allied defences collapsed. The secret to this expansion was Japan's naval superiority, not just aircraft carriers or battleships, but the complete integration of naval and air power. Japanese carrier Aviation had sunk 5 American battleships at Pearl Harbor without losing a single capital ship. The Kido Butai, the carrier striking force, had raided Darwin, Australia, and driven the British Eastern Fleet from the Indian Ocean. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized offensive action, surprise, and the concentration of force at the decisive point. By early 1943, this doctrine faced a new problem. Japan's conquests had outrun its ability to defend them. The empire now controlled territory from Burma to the Solomon Islands, from the Aleutians to the Dutch East Indies, a perimeter 5,000 miles long. To hold this perimeter required troops, and moving troops required ships. But Allied air power over New Guinea had grown stronger. American and Australian squadrons based at Port Moresby and Milne Bay could strike Japanese convoys crossing the Bismarck Sea. High-altitude bombing had proven ineffective. B-17. Flying fortresses attacking from 20,000 feet scored few hits on maneuvering ships. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was accurate. Japanese fighter cover was aggressive. Every convoy that attempted the run to Lai lost vessels, but enough got through to sustain the garrison. The Japanese calculated acceptable losses. If a convoy of 8 transports could deliver 4,000 troops despite losing 2 ships, the operation succeeded. If half the force arrived, that was sufficient. The alternative landing troops at Madang and marching them 140 miles through swamp and jungle without roads would take months and kill more men than enemy action. This calculus assumed Allied attacks would continue using conventional methods. High-altitude bombing, torpedo runs at medium altitude, fighter sweeps that could be countered with zeros. The Japanese Navy had trained for these scenarios. Their anti-aircraft gunners knew the approach angles, their fighter pilots knew the timing, their convoy commanders knew how to maneuver. What they did not anticipate was innovation driven by failure. American commanders in the Southwest Pacific had learned that standard tactics did not work. General George Kenney, who took command of the 5th Air Force in July of 1942, arrived in Australia to find an air force that was losing. His bombers could not hit ships. His fighters were outperformed by Zeros. His logistics were a disaster. Kenney responded not by requesting more resources, though he did that too, but by changing how his existing aircraft fought. He encouraged experimentation. He promoted officers who showed initiative. He listened to men like Paul Gunn, a former Navy enlisted pilot turned civilian bush pilot turned Army Air Force officer, who had ideas about how to modify bombers. Gunn's modification of the A-20 Havoc light bomber in the summer of 1942 had proven that concept worked. By removing the bombardier's station and installing 450 caliber machine guns in the nose, using weapons salvaged from wrecked fighters, Gunn created an aircraft that could strafe ground targets with devastating effect. The A-20 strafers had proven successful in low-level attacks on Japanese airfields and coastal positions. Kenney saw the potential. If the concept worked with the A-20, it could work with the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The B-25 had longer range, carried a heavier bomb load, and offered more space for forward-firing weapons. Gunn was authorized to modify a squadron's worth of aircraft. The modification removed the glazed bombardier's nose and replaced it with a solid metal nose packed with guns. Initial conversions carried 850 caliber machine guns. Later versions would carry 14. Some experimental aircraft mounted 75mm cannons. The idea was simple. Approach at extremely low altitude, suppress enemy anti-aircraft fire with overwhelming machine gun fire, then release bombs with delayed fuses that would skip across the water like stones and detonate against ship hulls below the waterline. This was not standard doctrine. No Air Force manual described skip bombing tactics. No training course taught masthead height attack runs. The technique was developed through trial and error by pilots willing to fly into anti-aircraft fire at altitudes where a single mistake meant hitting the water. The Japanese convoy that departed Rabaul on March 1, 1943, represented the culmination of imperial planning for New Guinea. 8 transport ships, Kyokusei Maru, Teiyo Maru, Nojima Maru, Aiyo Maru, Taimei Maru, Kembu Maru, Oigawa Maru, and Shinai Maru. 8 destroyers as escorts, Shikinami, Uranami, Shirayuki, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asagumo, Arashio, and Asashio. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded the escort force. He had assessed the risks. Allied air power over the Bismarck Sea was formidable, but his destroyers carried experienced anti-aircraft crews. His convoy would have continuous fighter cover from Rabaul-based Zeros. As many as 100 fighters would patrol overhead in rotating shifts. The weather forecast predicted cloud cover for the first 2 days of the voyage, providing natural concealment. Kimura's assessment was not unreasonable. Previous convoys had suffered losses, but had delivered troops. In January, a 5-ship convoy had lost 2 transports, but had landed 4,000 men at Leh. Acceptable casualties, the strategic imperative reinforcing Leh before Allied offensives cut it off, outweighed the tactical risk. The Japanese believed their convoy tactics were sound. Travel at night when possible. Maintain tight formation for concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Rely on fighter cover to disrupt Allied bomber formations before they reached attack positions. The doctrine had worked before. It should work again. What the Japanese did not know was that Allied codebreakers had read their convoy routing messages. Station Hypo in Hawaii and Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne had intercepted and decrypted Japanese naval communications, detailing the convoy's departure date, composition, route, and destination. Admiral Nimitz's intelligence staff passed this information to General MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane. MacArthur's intelligence officer, General Charles Willoughby, confirmed the convoy's intended path through the Bismarck Sea. This intelligence allowed Kenny to plan. He assembled every available aircraft in New Guinea. B-17 Flying Fortresses for high-altitude attack, B-25 Mitchells for skip bombing, A-20 Havocs for strafing, P-38 Lightning fighters for escort and air superiority, and Bristol Beaufighters from the Royal Australian Air Force for initial suppression runs. The plan was unprecedented in its coordination, multiple aircraft types attacking in waves. Beaufighters would make the first pass, strafing Japanese ships at extremely low altitude to kill officers on bridges and suppress anti-aircraft guns. B-25 strafers would follow immediately, using their forward-firing machine guns to continue suppression while skip bombing. B-17 seconds would attack from medium altitude to force the convoy to maneuver. P-38 seconds would engage Japanese fighter cover above the battle. Kenny scheduled the main attack for March 3rd, when the convoy would be in the center of the Bismarck Sea, equidistant from Rabaul and Leh, with no possibility of reaching friendly air cover in time. The weather had to cooperate. The convoy had to maintain its predicted schedule. Every squadron had to execute its role precisely. The Japanese convoy encountered the first Allied search aircraft on March 2nd. B-24. Liberators shadowed the ships through breaks in cloud cover. High-altitude B-17 seconds attempted bombing runs but scored no confirmed hits. The weather remained overcast, limiting visibility. Kimura maintained course and speed. His fighter cover shot down several Allied aircraft. The convoy suffered no damage. By evening of March 2nd, the convoy had covered 200 miles. Leh was now closer than Rabaul. Kimura had successfully navigated the most dangerous portion of the voyage. One more day of transit would bring his transports within range of land-based anti-aircraft support and shallow coastal waters where submarines could not operate. That night, Japanese lookouts reported Allied aircraft engines overhead. PBY Catalina patrol bombers were following the convoy, radioing position updates to Kenny's headquarters. The Japanese could not shoot them down in darkness. They could only continue toward Leh and hope morning weather would remain overcast. March 3rd dawned clear. The storm front that had provided cover for 2 days had moved north. The Bismarck Sea was calm. Visibility was unlimited. The Japanese convoy steamed across open water under cloudless tropical sky, its ships silhouetted against blue ocean. At Allied airfields across New Guinea, Port Moresby, Dobodura, Milne Bay engines started. Aircraft taxied to runways. Crews performed final weapons checks. The attack Kenny had planned for 3 months was beginning. Paul Irvin Gunn was 43 years old on March 3, 1943, 20 years older than most pilots in his squadron. a former Navy enlisted aviator who had retired as a chief petty officer in December of 1939 after 21 years of service. He had flown fighters with the Towpatters Squadron. He had served as a flight instructor at Pensacola. He had learned aircraft maintenance as an enlisted machinist's mate before the Navy selected him for enlisted pilot training. After retirement, Gunn had moved to the Philippines and started an inter-island airline. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, his wife and 4 children were living in Manila. Gunn volunteered immediately, flying evacuation missions in unarmed civilian aircraft. He delivered medical supplies to besieged troops on Bataan, flying through Japanese-controlled airspace without weapons or armor. For this action, he received the Distinguished Flying Cross. His family was captured when Manila fell. They were interned at Santo Tomas prison camp. Gunn did not know if they were alive. This personal war drove his modifications work with an intensity that impressed even General Kenny. The A-20 Havoc light bomber that Gunn first modified in the summer of 1942 at Eagle Farm Airfield in Brisbane had been designed by Douglas Aircraft as a medium-altitude attack bomber. Standard armament consisted of 4 30-caliber machine guns in the nose, adequate for strafing, but insufficient for suppressing heavily defended targets. The aircraft carried a bomb load of 2,000 pounds and had a combat radius of approximately 400 miles. Gunn's modification was brutally simple. Remove the bombardier's glazed nose section, install a solid metal nose, mount 4 50-caliber machine guns salvaged from wrecked P-39 Airacobra and P-40 Warhawk fighters. The 50-caliber M2 Browning machine gun fired a half-inch diameter bullet at 2,800 feet per second, with a rate of fire between 450 and 600 rounds per minute. 4 guns firing simultaneously delivered approximately 2,000 rounds per minute. At close range, this volume of fire could soar through aircraft fuselages, destroy vehicles, and kill exposed personnel. The A-20 modification proved successful in low-level attacks on Japanese positions in New Guinea. Kenny authorized Gunn to apply the same concept to the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The B-25 offered significant advantages: longer range 1,200 miles combat radius, heavier bomb load 3,000 pounds, more internal space for additional weapons. Gunn's B-25 conversion was more ambitious. The standard B-25 bombardier's station was completely removed. A solid metal nose was fabricated and installed. Initial conversions mounted 8 50-caliber machine guns, 4 in the nose, 2 in blister packs on each side of the forward fuselage, and 2 in the dorsal turret that could be fired forward. Later conversions would increase this to 14 guns. Some experimental aircraft mounted a 75mm M4 cannon, the same weapon used in Sherman tanks, in the nose for anti-shipping work. The firepower was staggering. 14 50-caliber machine guns firing simultaneously delivered approximately 5,600 rounds per minute. At the standard combat load of 400 rounds per gun, a B-25 Strafer could sustain continuous fire for approximately 4 seconds. This was sufficient for one attack pass. Pilots learned to fire in short bursts to extend their ammunition through multiple passes. The skip bombing technique required precise execution. The aircraft approached the target at extremely low altitude, between 50 and 200 feet above water, airspeed between 180 and 200 miles per hour. The pilot lined up the target in his gun sight and opened fire with forward guns at approximately 1,000 yards range. This suppressed anti-aircraft fire and killed exposed deck crews. At 200 to 300 yards from the target, the pilot released bombs with 4 to 5 second delayed action fuses. The bombs struck the water, skipped like stones across the surface, hit the ship's hull at or below the waterline, sank, and detonated beneath the vessel. This technique required training that no Air Force manual described. Pilots practiced over empty ocean, learning to judge distance and altitude by eye. They dropped practice bombs painted with whitewash to mark impact points. They flew so low that propeller wash created visible disturbances on the water surface. At these altitudes, a single moment of inattention meant hitting the ocean at 200 miles per hour. The 3rd Bombardment Group and the 90th Bombardment Squadron conducted these training exercises throughout February of 1943. They practiced formation flying at wavetop height. They practiced gun synchronization to ensure all forward-firing weapons converged at the same point. They practiced emergency procedures for engine failure at altitudes where there was no time to bail out. By March 1st, when intelligence confirmed the Japanese convoy departure from Rabaul, 12 modified B-25 strafers were operational. Their crews had collectively flown hundreds of practice runs. They had refined their attack doctrine through trial and error. They had prepared for this specific mission, sinking transport ships in open water through coordinated low-level attack. The Japanese convoy, steaming toward Leh, had no defense against this tactic because they did not know it existed. Their anti-aircraft doctrine assumed bombers would attack from medium or high altitude, their gun crews trained to engage targets above 5,000 feet. Their lookouts watched the sky, not the wavetops. At 10:28 on the morning of March 3rd, the first wave of Bristol Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, dropped out of formation at 8,000 feet and dove toward the Japanese convoy. Squadron leader Keith MacDonald led 6 aircraft in line astern, accelerating to maximum speed as they descended. The Beaufighter was a twin-engine heavy fighter, armed with 4 20mm Hispano cannons and 6 30-caliber machine guns in the nose. Designed for anti-shipping strikes, it was faster and more heavily armed than any light bomber in the Pacific theater. MacDonald's pilots had trained specifically for masthead height attack runs against ships. At 50 feet above the water, MacDonald opened fire on the lead Japanese destroyer at 800 yards range. The 20mm cannons fired high explosive shells that detonated on impact. The machine guns added a stream of tracer rounds that allowed the pilot to walk his fire onto the target. MacDonald raked the destroyer's bridge and superstructure, killing officers and destroying fire control equipment. The 5 Beaufighters following MacDonald each selected targets. They swept across the convoy at 300 miles per hour, firing continuously. Their attack lasted less than 30 seconds. They inflicted catastrophic damage to Japanese command and control. Bridge crews died at their posts. Communications equipment was destroyed. Fire direction systems were shot to pieces. The Japanese anti-aircraft response was immediate but disorganized. Gunners who had been scanning the sky for high-altitude bombers suddenly faced aircraft at eye level, moving at speeds that made tracking almost impossible. They fired frantically, filling the air with tracers, but the Beaufighters were already past, pulling up and away. 30 seconds after the Beaufighters completed their run, Paul Gunn led the first flight of modified B-25 strafers into attack. He approached the transport Kyokusei Maru from astern, using the ship's wake as an aiming reference. At 1,000 yards, he opened fire with his 8 forward-firing 50-caliber guns. The effect was devastating. 50-caliber bullets tore through the transport's thin stern plating. They shredded lifeboats. They killed soldiers packed on deck. They ignited aviation fuel stored in drums. Gunn held his fire for 3 seconds, walked his tracers up the ship's centerline, then released 2 500-pound bombs at 200 yards. The bombs hit the water 10 feet from the ship's hull, skipped, struck the ship below the waterline, sank, and detonated. The underwater explosions ripped open the transport's hull. Water rushed into the engine room and cargo holds. Kyokusei Maru began listing immediately. Behind Gunn, 11 more B-25 strafers attacked in rapid succession. Each pilot selected a target. Each made his approach at wavetop height. Each opened fire at maximum range and held down the trigger until releasing bombs. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Japanese gunners who survived the Beaufighter attack died under 50-caliber bullets. Anti-aircraft positions were silenced. The transports, designed for cargo not combat, had no armor and minimal subdivision. Bombs that penetrated their hulls created flooding that could not be controlled. Lieutenant Charles Howe attacked the transport Teiyo Maru. He scored 1 direct hit amidships and a near miss that opened the hull below the waterline. Teiyo Maru began sinking immediately. Soldiers jumped into the ocean as the ship listed to port. Major Edward Larner, commanding the 90th Bombardment Squadron, attacked the destroyer Tokitsukaze. His bombs struck near the destroyer's magazine. The resulting explosion broke the ship's back. Tokitsukaze sank in less than 4 minutes. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The coordinated attack lasted 15 minutes. Wave after wave of Allied aircraft struck the convoy. B-17 flying fortresses bombed from 12,000 feet, forcing the Japanese ships to maneuver and breaking their formation. A-20 Havocs made strafing runs on damaged vessels. P-38 Lightning fighters engaged Japanese Zero fighters, trying to intercept the bombers, shooting down multiple enemy aircraft. By 10:45, all 8 Japanese transports were sinking or dead in the water. 4 destroyers were severely damaged. The sea was covered with wreckage, oil slicks, and hundreds of men struggling in the water. Aboard the destroyer Shikinami, Captain Yasuo Sato watched his convoy disintegrate. He had commanded destroyers since 1938. He had escorted convoys throughout the Pacific. He had never witnessed destruction on this scale or at this speed. The American bombers had attacked at altitudes his gunners could not engage. They had approached so low and fast that his lookouts had only seconds of warning. They had used a bombing technique, skip bombing, that defeated all his tactical training. His anti-aircraft doctrine assumed bombers would attack from altitude, giving gun crews time to track and engage. These bombers appeared at masthead height already firing, released bombs at point-blank range, and were gone before effective counterfire could be organized. Sato's radio crackled with distress calls. Kyokusei Maru was sinking by the stern, soldiers abandoning ship. Teiyo Maru had capsized, trapping hundreds of men below decks. Shirayuki, one of the escort destroyers, reported flooding in multiple compartments and requested assistance. Tokitsukaze had disappeared, the destroyer had exploded, and sank so quickly that Sato had not seen it happen. The carefully planned convoy formation had dissolved into chaos. Transport ships drifted without power, their engine rooms flooded or their machinery destroyed. Destroyers maneuvered frantically, trying to avoid collisions with sinking vessels while maintaining anti-aircraft fire against continuing air attacks. The sky was full of American aircraft bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes, more aircraft than Sato had ever seen in one place. His promised fighter cover was engaged elsewhere. The 100 Zeros from Rabaul were fighting P-38 Lightnings at high altitude, drawn away from the convoy by aggressive Allied fighter sweeps. The few fighters that dove to defend the ships were outnumbered and overwhelmed. Sato watched 3 Zeros shot down in as many minutes. By noon, the battle was over. All 8 transports were sunk or sinking. 4 destroyers were severely damaged. Sato's Shikinami and 3 other destroyers remained operational. The ocean was covered with debris and survivors. 6,900 soldiers had been aboard the transports. Sato estimated 3,000 were dead, killed by bombs, strafing, drowning in sinking ships, or trapped below decks. The survivors floated in the water, clinging to wreckage, waiting for rescue. Sato began rescue operations immediately. His destroyers pulled men from the water. They filled every available space decks, passageways, even engine rooms with waterlogged soldiers, but Allied aircraft continued to circle overhead. At 1400 hours, American PT boats appeared on the horizon. At 1600 hours, more bombers arrived and attacked lifeboats and rafts with machine gun fire. General Kenny had ordered his air crews to prevent survivors from reaching shore. He called these missions mopping up operations. The official after-action report stated, if any survivors were permitted to slip by our strafing aircraft, they were a minimum of 30 miles from land, in water thickly infested by man-eating sharks. By nightfall, Sato's destroyers had rescued 2,700 men. Another 850 reached Leh by clinging to wreckage or paddling rafts through the night. The remaining 3,300 were dead. An entire division, the main body of the 51st Division, had been destroyed before firing a shot. The psychological impact on the Japanese Navy was profound. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet at Rabaul, reported to Imperial General Headquarters. It is certain that the success obtained by the American Air Force in this battle dealt a fatal blow to the South Pacific. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding one of the destroyer escorts, wrote after the war, "Japan's defeat there was unbelievable. Never was there such a debacle." The tactical lessons were equally clear. Surface ships could not transit waters controlled by enemy land-based aircraft operating at low altitude with modified armament. The doctrine of acceptable convoy losses was obsolete. Skip bombing at masthead height negated anti-aircraft defenses designed for high-altitude engagement. American industrial capacity allowed field modifications like Gunn's gun packages that Japanese forces could not counter because they did not know such modifications existed. After the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Japanese forces in New Guinea never again received large-scale reinforcement by ship. Future resupply efforts used small coastal barges traveling at night, hugging shorelines, carrying supplies measured in tons rather than thousands of tons. The logistics network sustaining Japanese garrisons along the northern New Guinea coast had been severed. Without reinforcement, without resupply, these garrisons could only defend, retreat, and eventually starve. The morning after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, reconnaissance aircraft photographed the debris field. Oil slicks stretched for miles. Wreckage covered 40 square miles of ocean. Bodies floated among the debris, thousands of them. Japanese survivors clung to rafts and wreckage, waiting for rescue that would never come in sufficient numbers. Allied aircraft returned on March 4th and 5th. They strafed lifeboats. They machine-gunned men floating in life jackets. They attacked rescue vessels attempting to reach survivors. The official 5th Air Force report described these missions in clinical language. Sighted barge, consisting of 200 survivors. Have finished attack, no survivors. This deliberate killing of shipwrecked sailors violated traditional naval conventions. But General Kenny justified the decision in practical terms. Every Japanese soldier pulled from the water was a soldier who would fight at Lae or Salamaua or Madang. Every survivor rescued was a combatant returned to the battlefield. The strategic objective was not merely to sink ships, but to eliminate the combat power those ships carried. The Japanese rescued approximately 2,700 men and returned them to Rabaul. Another 850 reached Lae through various means, paddling rafts, swimming, clinging to debris until picked up by submarines or small craft. Of 6,900 soldiers who departed Rabaul on March 1st, 3,300 were dead by March 5th. An entire division's worth of infantry had been destroyed without engaging ground forces. The material losses were equally catastrophic. All 8 transport ships sunk 63,000 tons of shipping. 4 destroyers sunk another 6,000 tons. The destroyers Shirayuki, Tokitsukaze, Asashio, and Arashio were total losses. 4 more destroyers suffered damage requiring months of repair. The escort force that departed Rabaul with 8 destroyers returned with 4 barely functional vessels. The cargo aboard the transport's ammunition, food, medical supplies, artillery pieces, vehicles, aviation fuel, all rested on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The supplies intended to sustain the Lae garrison for months were gone. The reinforcements needed to defend against Allied offensives would never arrive. Allied losses, by comparison, were negligible. 13 aircrewmen killed. 6 aircraft lost 5 to combat, 1 to accident. 8 airmen wounded. Against this, the Allies had destroyed a 16-ship convoy and killed more than 3,000 enemy soldiers. The exchange ratio was unprecedented in Pacific naval combat. General Douglas MacArthur called the battle one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. Admiral Chester Nimitz described it as a decisive victory that secured Allied control of the Southwest Pacific. Military historians would later rank it among the most one-sided naval engagements in history, a major fleet action won entirely by aircraft, without a single Allied warship participating. The strategic implications became apparent within weeks. Japanese forces at Lae went on short rations. Their artillery ammunition was rationed. Their ability to conduct offensive operations ceased. When Australian forces advanced on Lae in September of 1943, they found a garrison weakened by months of inadequate supply. The town fell quickly. More broadly, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea demonstrated that Japan could no longer move large forces by sea in waters where Allied aircraft operated. The convoy tactics that had worked in early 1942, concentrated formations with destroyer escorts and fighter cover, were obsolete. Skip bombing and low-level strafing attacks defeated those tactics completely. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo recognized this reality. Future troop movements in the Southwest Pacific would use submarines, small coastal vessels, and barges traveling at night. Large convoys in daylight were too vulnerable. This change in doctrine had cascading effects. Submarines could carry dozens of men, not thousands. Barges could haul tons of supplies, not hundreds of tons. The logistical capacity to sustain major ground operations in New Guinea vanished. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the 8th Area Army at Rabaul, wrote in his diary, "We can no longer reinforce or supply our forward positions by conventional means. The Americans have developed tactics we cannot counter." Vice Admiral Mikawa recommended abandoning attempts to hold Leh and withdrawing forces to more defensible positions closer to Rabaul. His recommendation was rejected, but the underlying assessment was accurate. Japan's position in New Guinea had become untenable. Paul Gunn did not attend the victory celebration at Port Moresby after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. He returned to Brisbane and immediately began work on the next modification project. General Kenny wanted more strafers. He wanted heavier armament. He wanted the tactics refined and standardized, so that every squadron in the 5th Air Force could execute skip bombing attacks. Gunn spent April of 1943 at the North American Aviation factory in California, teaching engineers how to incorporate his field modifications into production aircraft. The B-25G model, introduced in late 1943, featured a solid nose with a 75mm cannon and 450 caliber machine guns as standard armament. The B-25H model carried 14 forward-firing 50 caliber guns. The B-25J model offered both bombardier nose and solid nose variants. All incorporated lessons learned from Gunn's improvised modifications. By war's end, these factory-built strafers had destroyed hundreds of Japanese vessels throughout the Pacific. They sank cargo ships off the Philippines. They destroyed barges along the coast of New Guinea. They attacked shipping in the South China Sea. The tactics developed through trial and error in Australian workshops became standard doctrine taught at training schools in the United States. Gunn continued flying combat missions throughout the war. He participated in the liberation of the Philippines in 1944. He was present when American forces recaptured Manila in February of 1945. His family, his wife and 4 children who had been interned at Santo Tomas, were freed when the 1st Cavalry Division liberated the prison camp. They had survived 3 years of captivity. Gunn had not known if they were alive until he saw them walking out of the camp. He retired from the Army Air Force as a colonel in 1946. He returned to civilian life and rebuilt his inter-island airline business. On October 11, 1957, he was killed when his aircraft crashed during a storm near Manila. He was 57 years old. His funeral was attended by hundreds of Filipino civilians who remembered him flying medical supplies into Bataan in 1942, risking his life to help strangers. General Kenny wrote Gunn's official biography, titled The Saga of Pappy Gunn, published in 1959. In it, Kenny described Gunn as the most remarkable aerial warrior I ever met. He credited Gunn's modifications with changing the course of the Pacific Air War. Without Pappy's strafers, Kenny wrote, we could not have stopped the Japanese convoys. Without stopping the convoys, we could not have retaken New Guinea. The war would have lasted years longer. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point not just in the New Guinea campaign, but in the application of air power against naval targets. It demonstrated that land-based aircraft, using innovative tactics and modified equipment, could achieve results previously thought to require carrier-based aviation or surface warships. This lesson influenced American strategic planning for the remainder of the war. The island-hopping campaign across the Pacific relied heavily on air superiority, achieved through land-based aircraft operating from captured or newly built airfields. Each island taken provided a base from which aircraft could dominate surrounding waters. Japanese forces attempting to reinforce or resupply bypassed islands faced the same fate as the convoy at the Bismarck Sea, destruction from the air without possibility of defense. The psychological impact on Japanese forces cannot be overstated. Soldiers throughout the Southwest Pacific knew that reinforcement was unlikely. Resupply was sporadic at best. They were cut off, isolated, fighting a defensive war they could not win. Morale collapsed. Desertions increased. Entire units disintegrated as food supplies ran out and tropical diseases took their toll. Japanese naval officers who survived the war remembered the Bismarck Sea as the moment they understood Japan would lose. Captain Tamechi Hara, who commanded the destroyer Shigure through multiple engagements, wrote in his memoir, "After the Bismarck Sea, we knew. The Americans had learned to use their aircraft in ways we could not counter. Their industrial capacity allowed them to replace losses overnight. We could not match this. We could only delay the inevitable. The industrial dimension was crucial. America produced over 297,000 aircraft during World War II. Japan produced 76,000. This quantitative advantage was multiplied by qualitative improvements, field modifications like guns that were quickly incorporated into factory production, creating aircraft specifically designed for the conditions they would face in combat. Japan lacked this adaptive capacity. Their aircraft designs were standardized and difficult to modify. Their industrial base could not support rapid innovation. Their tactical doctrine remained rigid. When American forces developed new tactics, Japanese forces struggled to respond. March 3, 1943, began with a Japanese convoy steaming confidently toward Leh. 16 ships in tight formation, 6,900 soldiers, supplies sufficient to sustain a garrison for months, a plan approved by Imperial General Headquarters, an operation protected by destroyer escorts and fighter cover. It ended with the ocean covered in wreckage and bodies, with 8 transport ships on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea, with more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers dead, with the remainder rescued or struggling to reach shore, with Japan's ability to reinforce New Guinea by conventional convoy permanently destroyed. The difference between these two states, between confident departure and catastrophic defeat, was measured in 15 minutes of combat. 15 minutes during which modified American bombers attacked at altitudes and with tactics the Japanese had never encountered. 15 minutes during which industrial improvisation defeated military doctrine. Paul Gunn's contribution to this outcome was direct and measurable. His modifications to the A-20 and B-25 created the aircraft that destroyed the convoy. His development of skip bombing tactics provided the method. His personal leadership flying in the first wave at age 43 demonstrated the technique to younger pilots who followed his example. But Gunn's innovation represented something larger than individual genius. It represented a systemic American advantage in the Pacific War, the ability to improvise, the willingness to experiment, the industrial capacity to rapidly implement successful innovations, the command structure that rewarded initiative rather than punishing deviation from doctrine. General Kenny encouraged officers like Gunn to try new approaches. He provided resources for experimentation. He protected innovators from bureaucratic interference. When modifications proved successful, he ensured they were standardized and mass-produced. This cycle of innovation, testing, and implementation gave American forces capabilities that Japanese intelligence did not know existed until they encountered them in combat. The Japanese convoy commander who departed Rabaul on March first believed his anti-aircraft doctrine would protect against air attack. He believed his fighter cover would intercept Allied bombers before they reached attack positions. He believed his convoy formation would allow concentrated defensive fire. All these beliefs were reasonable based on previous experience. All proved inadequate when confronted with skip-bombing strafers. The soldiers aboard those transports believed they would reach Leh, disembark, join the garrison, and prepare defensive positions. They believed their sacrifice enduring the dangerous convoy journey served a strategic purpose. They believed Japanese control of New Guinea could be maintained. 3,000 of them died before learning these beliefs were false. The 15 minutes that destroyed the convoy also destroyed Japanese strategic assumptions about the Southwest Pacific. After March 3rd, Imperial General Headquarters understood that large-scale reinforcement by sea was impossible, that logistics networks could be severed by air power alone, that defensive positions without resupply would eventually collapse, that the war in New Guinea was lost. This understanding rippled outward. If New Guinea could not be held, the Philippines were vulnerable. If the Philippines fell, the sea lanes connecting Japan to its conquered empire would be cut. If those sea lanes were cut, the oil fields in the Dutch East Indies became useless. Without oil, the combined fleet could not operate. Without the fleet, the empire could not be defended. The line of causation from Gunn's modifications to Japanese strategic defeat was not direct, but it was real. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was one of dozens of engagements in the Pacific, but it was an engagement that demonstrated irreversible American advantages in industrial innovation, tactical flexibility, and operational execution. 70 years later, military historians study the Bismarck Sea as a case study in tactical innovation. How field modifications changed combat outcomes, how individual initiative shaped strategic results, how a 43-year-old former Navy enlisted pilot, working in an Australian workshop with salvaged parts, created weapons that helped win the Pacific War. Paul Gunn never claimed credit for winning anything. When asked about his role after the war, he said simply that he did his job. He saw problems in inadequate aircraft armament, ineffective bombing tactics, and he solved them. The fact that his solutions changed naval warfare was, in his view, beside the point. Problems required solutions. He provided them. This modesty characterized the American response to innovation throughout the war. The engineers who designed better aircraft, the factory workers who built them faster, the pilots who learned to fly them effectively, the commanders who encouraged experimentation. None claimed to be changing history. All were simply doing their jobs. The cumulative effect of millions of people doing their jobs effectively was victory. The Japanese convoy that departed Rabaul on March 1, 1943, never reached Lae. It never delivered its soldiers or supplies. It never achieved its strategic objective. It was destroyed by aircraft that should not have been able to sink ships, using tactics that had not existed 6 months earlier, flown by pilots whose average age was 23, led by a former enlisted man who was supposed to be retired. 15 minutes, 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers destroyed, 3,000 soldiers killed. Japan's last major attempt to reinforce New Guinea by conventional convoy annihilated. The Pacific War fundamentally altered, all because an aging pilot in an Australian workshop believed bombers could be made better, and a general believed him enough to let him try. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.